everyone. Welcome to another episode of our Public Safety Innovation webinar series. Thanks for joining us. My name is Chris Arterberry of Envisage Technologies, your host for today's webinar. Before we kick it off, I have a few things to cover with you. First, today's presentation will run about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. To ask questions, just enter them into the chat box in the lower left corner of your screen, and you can do that at any time. Second, we're recording today's webinar, so you'll be able to watch it again if need be, or you can share with others, and we'll make that available here in the coming days. Finally, a little bit about us. Envisage Technologies is the leader in training and compliance technology for public safety professionals with over 1.3 million professionals using our technology. We help ensure that our first responders are trained, equipped, and ready, and we're passionate about raising the bar on training. In short, we believe that readiness saves lives. We provide the Public Safety Innovation webinar series because we're committed to improving public safety through awareness and innovation, and we want to help get great ideas and best practices out there, especially those that can save lives. Now for today's topic, which deals in part with best practices that can save lives. Fire officers face more problematic legal issues in today's work environment than ever before. Doing the right thing at the right time and documenting it is the cornerstone of an affirmative legal defense. But how do you do that when it comes to training? Could you say exactly what your training liabilities are? What are common aspects of training that increase risk? What defines good training and what constitutes good documentation? Today we have with us John Murphy to discuss this and more. John retired as a deputy fire chief after 32 years of career fire department service, managing all areas of fire department operations and management positions. His past fire and emergency medical experience includes paramedic firefighter, paramedic program director, chief fire officer, chief of training, emergency operations chief, and health and safety officer. He's now an attorney who specializes in risk management and liability, training safety, and developing employment policy and best practices. John is a graduate of the Seattle University School of Law and is also a physician's assistant with a focus in urgent, emergency, occupational, and pre-hospital medical care. John, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Chris. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to this audience about a passion of mine that deals not only with the training aspect, as my former life as a training chief of my department, but also as an attorney working around the country with different attorneys, educating, I think, fire departments in safe practices and best practices and try to avoid litigation. So thank you.
Our pleasure.
Are we ready to rock and roll?
Yep. The floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you. So, today we're going to take a look at what constitutes training liabilities. Where are your legal liabilities and your risks if you provide improper training or have unqualified instructors that are providing that training to your firefighters? We're going to talk a little bit about what constitutes good training, and there's enough good training out there, maybe in your own neighboring jurisdictions or material that you've created in the past for your department, which is considered pretty classical for your area of operation. So we'll talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about the local laws that guide training, and surprisingly, when you take a look at the legislation and the litigation that we help support and defend fire departments, when you take a look at the law as an example on NFPA, which we're going to talk about later in the presentation, we always say, well, if you didn't adopt the NFPA standard, then how can you use that as some sort of a defense? And so, for an example, in the state of California, for those of you who are in California, other than the electrical codes under NFPA, there's essentially no fire codes or fire issues under the NFPA that's been adopted by organizations. So we need to take a look at what your state laws are, what your local ordinances are, and again, what your department policies are as it deals with training. The next item is our training officers. And so when we talk about training officers, what qualifies you to be the training officer. And when I do this class around the country, I always say, who's the training officer in the class? And about half the class raises their hands. And I said, who was volunteered by your organization to be the training officer? And about half the class drops their hands. And then, the final question is, who's qualified to be a training officer? And about a third of the class, their hands are remaining. So there's some issues and standards that we need to look at as to what constitutes certification as a training officer. Kind of towards the end of the presentation, we're going to talk about documentation and the little nuances that I think that are important for an affirmative legal defense, which I look for when I consult with clients or I work with other attorneys on litigation. And so documentation, again, is the cornerstone of an affirmative defense. And you've all heard the adage that if it's not documented, it didn't happen. We usually refer that as an EMS mantra. But certainly in anything that we do in our organization, especially as it deals with training, needs to be well documented. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then at the end of the presentation, we're going to talk about some preventative measures and some best practices that are easily to implement into your organization. So today we want to look at what our goals are. And so we've got 6 different goals in front of us. We want to understand liability and risk management. My whole practice as a lawyer and my practice as a deputy chief was try to avoid risk, because as much as I loved lawyers, I hated lawyers as the deputy chief, only because they'd be knocking at my door and say, what are you doing? And then can you validate what you've done? And because we have to defend, some activity or stupid practice that you did when you're in your position. So I've learned a lot in the School of Hard Knocks as it deals with what our risk management is. We'll talk about good training. We look at, again, what the state laws are affecting your particular jurisdiction. And the law in every state is a little bit different. Again, unless you adopt some certain standards, like our state here in Washington State, under the revised codes of Washington and the Washington Administrative Codes, have adopted NFPA 1500, which is a safety standard. So all departments that operate in our state have to follow those particular mandates outlined by NFPA. So you need to understand what your state laws are as well. We're going to talk a little bit, a lot maybe about how to avoid liability, and a lot of liability avoidance is just in good practices, good policies in the organization, good best practices, the things that we would like to see in a good training program to make sure that our firefighters and our EMS providers are safe out in the field. And then we're going to talk about documenting all that sort of stuff, because if I'm the guy that comes in to your organization and have been hired either by your insurance company, or if you are self-insured by your company, by your organization, I'm going to ask for documentation, and I'm hoping that you have it. And all lawyers hoping that you have it. You're not in an indefensible spot, but it's easier to defend good practice if you write those things down. And then we're going to talk about prevention and preventative measures at the very last. So your training liability, as it says in front of you, is any situation in which the fire department employees are subject to being sued in court for actions or omissions while providing training instruction in an official capacity. And so I get, people ask questions, well, I have my own training company, I do this sort of training, and so the question is there a greater liability for me as an independent trainer? And I think that there is. If you don't follow, existing guidelines and standards. And the other part is you need adequate malpractice insurance to make sure that you're, you're well covered if there's an event in your organization. And a good example is Smoke Diver School, I think in Texas a couple of years ago, where they had an independent company come in and we're doing smoke diver classes on an extremely hot and humid day. They put 4 or 5 people in the hospital as a result of it, and one of the participants died in those particular training events. So there's a huge liability, and the instructors weren't paying attention to time and temperature and rehabilitation issues. And one firefighter died from hyperthermia, where when they got him to the hospital, his core temperature was over 107 degrees, which is incompatible with life. So we just have to be very careful on how we conduct our training. The risk factors, that's a good segue to get into there, is poor planning. And how many times have you gone out on a training drill and everybody's standing around on the apparatus bay or they're out in the field and they're going, so what are we going to do? And I think that's a horrible way to start a training event. I'm always looking at order, how we end up getting an appropriate lesson plan that's out to the firefighters before they go out so they understand what's going on. The instructors understand what's going on. The safety officer, which is the next bullet here, you should have a safety officer, because what I try to teach is let's train like we're going to play, right? So if you're a football team, you just don't go out on a Sunday and throw the ball out and start playing ball. I mean, you're practicing for months, you're practicing the week before, and we need to do the same thing in the fire service, is that we need to understand what the playbook looks like, what the plays are, how we're going to approach a particular fire or a rescue operation, and then make sure that we incorporate all the elements in an actual operation, such as the safety officer or rehabilitation and those sorts of things. The next item is lack of proper PPE, and one of the biggest bugaboos that I have is that many times we'll outfit new firefighters, probationary firefighters, or recruits in the stuff that's the hand-me-downs from your organization that's probably out of compliance and ill-fitting, and especially if you deal with women firefighters who are of smaller stature, small firefighters who have who are maybe short, or the oversized, extra-large firefighters where you don't have bunker clothing to fit them. And I think it's incumbent on an organization to make sure that everybody is properly outfitted, from top to bottom, with adequate breathing apparatus that their mask actually fits. And a good case to look at is the city of Baltimore, probably 10 years ago or 8 years ago, where they had a recruit, woman firefighter that died as a result of training activities, where all of the things we're going to talk about today, Baltimore City Fire Department failed to comply with, and the firefighter died. The chief basically resigned. The whole training division turned over to new guys. This family filed a lawsuit. The state labor and industry looked at 38 different factors dealing with improper equipment, and and the lawsuit was massive. And a firefighter candidate died as a result of that. So make sure your firefighters are outfitted properly. The other thing was student to instructor ratio, which in this Baltimore event was a problem. Not enough instructors for the number of students they had. They had a set of row houses, for those of you who live in the city and understand what those are. It's just multiple houses that are directly connected to each other. Had multiple fires going on in there, a lot of firefighters in there, not enough instructors to make sure nobody got injured. And then the other thing that was found in this particular case is the instructors were unqualified. And so in this academy, what they did was they recruited firefighters in to be academy company officers and monitors, and they weren't qualified to do the job that they were asked to do or instructed to do. And so, this firefighter died, and other firefighters have died or been severely injured as a result of unqualified instructors. So one of the questions you would ask is, how do I get qualified, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But people that have additional training, additional certifications, additional experience, longevity in the department, probably make your best instructors if they can instruct. But there are certain requirements that I would look for as an attorney to ensure that your instructors are qualified. So for an example, in driver training, there's 4 or 5 programs out in the world that we use to do driver training, but are the people that are checking off the boxes and sitting in the right-hand seat, doing the things that they're supposed to do to make sure that you're a good driver and that they're qualified to check you off. And then the last one is unqualified students. And so if you take a look at statistics on, how firefighters are dying, unfortunately, we die from cardiac arrest. And much of the time it's after training or during a training event. So we want to make sure that your firefighters are medically qualified, and that they have good pre-training training, either in a classroom or they do stuff online that maybe your department has, or if you do combined training, you want to make sure that your firefighters are out there who are as best qualified as possible entering into the sort of skills aspect of a complete training package. The other thing is boot camp mentality. And so, and most of you, or many of you who have been in the military understand what boot camp mentality is. And it's essentially trying to humiliate a person into compliance. And we're not in that sort of environment in the fire service. We're trying to present a learning experience for our firefighters, a good educational experience. We don't need somebody yelling or screaming like, the DIs that you have for those of you who are the Marines, those of you who are in the Army. The Navy wasn't so bad, and I'm not sure whether the Air Force actually has people who yell at you. Just kidding. You understand that sort of mentality. And so as we're older adults, we have a lot of people from the military that are coming into the fire service. They've been through that process. And so we don't want them to just think about, kind of hammering home the point. That's leading by example and getting away from the boot camp mentality. I alluded to earlier a little bit about rehabilitation facilities. I always say you need to feed and water and rest your firefighters that are in training, because some days it's hot, some days it's cold, some days it's cool. People get wet, they get dehydrated, they get hungry. So let's practice like we're going to play, and you should have a rehabilitation organization or outfit at every working fire that you go on, so your firefighters are well hydrated, your firefighters are fed, and they have certain standards that you go by. And the NFPA has a standard for rehabilitation. You sort of adopt the guidelines. You don't necessarily have to adopt the standard, but at least take a look at those standards and then try to implement some of those as a best practice. Again, the law plays an important part, so don't violate the law. You won't get sued, is my mantra. So take a look at what your laws are as it deals with training and safety and firefighter rehabilitation and those sorts of things, and put those all into play in your organization. And the last one, common risk factors, is failure of common sense. And I always say that common sense is not all that common. So sometimes in our own experience, we bring those either good or bad habits into a training environment. So just take a look at the good stuff that you learned and try to promote that with your firefighter recruits and ongoing training. There's a lot of issues going on, I think, in the country that putting an increased pressure on our services. Certainly there's, if you take a look at budgetary issues, there's closures of fire station. Even in today's paper up here in Seattle, there's a cancer scare at one of the fire stations in Seattle, so they're doing extensive research. So they eventually will have to close that station and relocate those firefighters somewhere else, which changes the response pattern. We're looking at fewer firefighters, especially in the volunteer cadre. We are seeing sort of an overall decline in volunteerism in the country, and volunteer firefighters are certainly being affected by that due to the increased training, the lack of time. If you have a family and you're working, not a lot of time for being a volunteer. And that's where we're trying to encourage. There's a couple of guys out there. Tom Merrill from Connecticut is one, is doing a very good job actually talking about volunteer firefighters as professionals in his lectures. So we're trying to recruit more volunteers, but we have a problem, I think, in that. And then we're getting assaulted a lot more. We're people in the badge. We're a uniform. I think there's this sort of beginning, although when I was a paramedic firefighter, we have a few patients that would try to attack us. But I think now more than ever, we're getting shot at, where they've had a couple of firefighters get shot. We're getting stabbed. We're getting assaulted. And so we need to, part of our training is protection. How do we protect ourselves from these sort of assaults, which we haven't seen before? We alluded to less training time. People have busy lives. If you're at a busy house, as an example, as a career firefighter, you're on calls or inspections. Training is a valuable time commodity, and I think it's incumbent on the department to ensure that there's adequate training time. And, I try to encourage my guys that you don't just come to work at 8 and you stop at 5. We're there 24 hours, and so we need to get this philosophy that, we can be training at 10 o'clock at night. Especially if you have volunteers that are part of a career organization, you want to make sure that the career and the volunteer are working together, and sometimes that is training at 7 or 8 at nighttime. And especially weekends. Weekends is usually downtime for a lot of people, and so those are valuable periods of time that you can do training for your firefighters, and I think that's important. Budgets are always a big bugaboo. Money goes to other places. We got to get new equipment. We got to build new stations. We have to do this, that, and the other thing. Usually training gets the short end of the stick on these sorts of things. And so if you're the training officer, you have to be astute as to the budgetary process and what your role is in ensuring that you do have adequate money in your organization to provide the level of training that's so important to you as a fire officer or a fire training officer or a fire trainer, and your firefighters and your community, right? So there are a lot of grants out there, so be aware of the firefighter grants that are available. You can take a look at your neighbor Kiwanis Club, do a fundraiser. There's a lot of ways to raise money, so be creative and that sort of stuff. We're looking at changing missions. Our mission creep is the other one. We've been asked to do more with less dollars, and you guys who are out in the world doing the job, you understand that. You're asked to do this, that, the other thing. We're taking a look more at tactical medics, especially those of you who have paramedic services or police services that do SWAT operations. We do all kinds of stuff, and I think training, I always tell people that you can't train for every single solitary event that's going to happen in your organization. Impossible. But what is possible is a good training foundation that allows people to creatively fix something that you may have never seen in a training environment. So you get 2 or 3 firefighters that have a good fundamental training knowledge, and maybe some outside experiences if they work a second job, or they have a machine shop, or they're carpenters or plumbers or those sorts of things. You can creatively get together and resolve a problem for which you were called. So we need to be flexible, but I think our training needs to be adequate enough to allow that flexibility. And then the last one here is always political issues, and we're always challenged by parks and police and other municipal services that are dipping into diminishing funds. And so your fire chief and you as a fire training officer and your officers need to be politically aware as to what's going on in your neighborhood and the challenges that you're facing even as we speak today. We have a lot of firefighters. There's like 1.1 million nationally, 323,000 career, 800,000 volunteer, and about 30,000 fire departments that actually register through the NFPA in the NFIRS program. And so, volunteers make up a large portion of the fire suppression activities. And so focusing on, volunteer recruitment, how we train them, how we outfit them, how we expect them to respond is a full-time job for somebody in your organization. It may not always be the fire chief. So, and the other thing I like to say is we have a lot of opportunity to do good things and train your firefighters well. We also have equally as many opportunities to screw up training to provide a bad training event where somebody gets hurt or dies as a result of a bad training event. So be careful. We look at the annual firefighter injury, and this came out of the NFPA, and U.S. Fire Administration does an annual survey of injuries and deaths in the fire service. And so it's, over the last 10 years, has sort of boiled down to these numbers. One of the fortunate things is that we're not killing as many firefighters as we used to at fire events, but we're seeing an uptick in cardiac events or medical events that are, causing death or serious illness in our firefighters. So that's why when we say we want to make sure your firefighters are adequately trained, medically qualified and fit to participate, these are the numbers that are telling us what's going on. So the big number of 7,515 training-related injuries is a huge number, And when you take a look at the number, and if you are an OSHA-compliant state, you fill out an OSHA 300 form, which is a reportable injury. Some of these injuries that you see here are career-ending. So multiple fractures, brain injuries, stuff that causes people not to be able to pursue their career as firefighters. So it's incumbent on us, again, as training officers, to try to avoid injury and what I classify as friendly fire events. Is let's not hurt or kill our firefighters during a training event. So it is a vital part of our organization. We have a tendency to injure. Fortunately, we haven't. A lot of firefighters haven't died as a result of that. But in 16 years, over 200 firefighters have died as a result of the training. And again, we're looking at what we used to do earlier. They used to die actually from drownings and falls and entrapment. Now we're taking a look in modern day is that cardiac arrest or other medical issues are killing firefighters only because some organizations have bypassed a medical physical for bringing your firefighters in, or annual or biannual medical physicals to make sure your firefighters are healthy enough to continue on as firefighters and participate in training successfully. So just the numbers are telling. And in our journals, every day we lose firefighters. And so some of them are attributed to natural death, others are attributed to traumatic injury, others are training related. And so we have an environment that's hazardous, as we all know. So it's incumbent that when we do train our firefighters, we train them to avoid those sort of events that cause injuries or death. So the training principles are safety first, all right? So safety is an important component of what we do, and you need to kind of think about the whole training evolution. What does it entail? How are we going to do this? How many people are involved? What equipment are we going to be using? And so you need to kind of go through that process in your mind. I like to use a whiteboard to kind of outline a training event. I had a training booklet that we would do chapters on each of our training events. So we can go back later and replicate them if they were good or change them if they were not good. But we need to think about safety. So safety is an important component. It has to be educational and realistic. So educational is, again, you go back to the boot camp. We're not trying to flog people into compliance with maybe a bad training practice. We want it to be educational. And we take a look at your audience in your department are probably older. They may be military background, especially in volunteers departments. They have careers, they have families, and so they want to get educated. So they want to do the best they can for the organization and the community. So make sure that you have an educational component in there as well. And then the realistic component, as I talked about before, we want to make sure that we create a good foundation for training for your firefighters. So when they go out and meet an unusual circumstance, or they go out and they see something like, that they scratch their head and say, "Jeepers, I've never seen this before," they can work through a problem. They can work the problem. And so, and you want to make sure that you don't create an environment, again, where you kill or injure a firefighter. Falls, we see a couple of events this past year where firefighters have fallen off ladders. So the question is, were they attached with hose belts, or do they have restraining systems? We've seen a couple of ice water or ice rescue drownings in the United States and in Canada as well, where people were completely outfitted in cold water gear, but they slipped under the ice, and they couldn't get them out. They couldn't get down the river fast enough to cut a hole to extricate the firefighter, and the firefighter drowned. So we do want to do realistic training. We do practice burns. As an example, the NFPA 1403 standard looks at acquired structures. There's a whole training course on how to safely provide training for there. And a couple of organizations, ISFSI, the International Society of Fire Service Instructors, does a certifying course, and there's a couple other organizations that do the same thing. You want your instructors that are doing live fire training or acquired structure training to be the best qualified and certified. And an example of that was in Lairdsville, New York, a number of years ago, where a rookie firefighter who was only 2 weeks on the job wasn't even qualified to be in a working training fire, put a SCBA gear on, didn't know enough to turn it on, hidden some debris as they're doing a rescue drill. and they didn't find him, and the house caught on fire, and he ended up dying as a result of that. So the training officer went to jail. It's the only time in the country for you training officers you can breathe a sigh of relief that a training officer went to jail for the firefighter's death. But the Lairdsville Fire Department is essentially shut down, and it just was a horrible situation for the community and certainly for the family of the firefighter who passed away. So you want to make sure that you have realistic drills. And so for those of you who are interested, it's the Lairdsville Fire Department. I can't remember, there's a case number for it, but just take a look at all of the things that went wrong in that fire, and that's a good lesson to learn from your organization. The 10 rules of engagement, I'm not going to read all of these, but I think it's important that for those of you who are members of the North American Training Directors, kind of put out these sort of rules of engagement, creating a safe environment, a learning environment for firefighters during a training event. And it's a clear purpose, clear chain of command. Sometimes the chain of command gets foggy during a training event. You need to train like you're going to play, right? So remember that. Don't allow freelancing. And back when I was a firefighter, freelancing we used to do it, self-admittedly, but it became dangerous as we lost firefighters, in these sort of large warehouses or even ordinary house fires. And so no freelancing, qualified instructors we talked about, adhere to the national, state, and local standards for conducting training. And then Rule 6 is conduct training under acceptable conditions. And again, what is an acceptable condition? So because we practice in all kinds of conditions, and so we want to make sure that if we do create or train in an environment that may be hazardous, that we're extra cautious as to what those hazards are, and have close monitoring from your drill instructors, and even your firefighters can say stop, stop, and so and then reset the drill. Rule 7, safety precautions again, medically cleared, and Rule 8. And what does this take? There's the NFPA 1582 standard, which is a pretty onerous standard, but they have some very good guidelines, which I recommend individuals take a look at if you're going to do medical physicals on your firefighters, certainly your new firefighters, but in your incumbent firefighters, you want to make sure that they're healthy enough to continue. Rule 9, make sure the training is appropriate for their skill level, and that's the Lairdsville fire incident where that kid that went in, the new rookie went in, he had no skills at all. It's not his fault. It was just that he wanted to participate. Nobody was watching him. He ends up in the middle of a fire in a burn house and dies as a result of that. So we want to make sure that people that are in training events are well skilled, as are their instructors. And then the last one is allow participants to stop. And everybody, I always say, as a safety officer in any sort of event, especially in training events, but your firefighters should be made aware that they too are the safety officer. If they see something going sideways, then they need to stop. They need to stop. And then we talked about boot camp. And so the slide I had is Sergeant Hartman I can't remember the name of the movie right now, but he's yelling at these recruits. And so this is not Marine boot camp. And I know I was in a Marine boot camp as a Navy corpsman back in the day, and it's uncomfortable. And so we're not in that sort of environment here. Although we can get a lot done, it's not a good learning environment. So we need to take a look at risk factors, the training time and the environment that you're involved in, any sort of medical issues that may occur to your firefighters. If one of your firefighters is injured or has a cardiac arrest or any of those sorts of things, obviously you want to stop the drill and then take care of the injured firefighter, and then document those sort of activities. And we're going to talk about documentation in a couple of minutes, but you want to document that sort of a twist, unfortunately, in a what may have been an smoothly operating training event. You also want to acknowledge psychological issues that in a boot camp environment, there's psychology, there's harassment, there's bullying, there's hazing, there's all the things that are discriminatory, and we'll talk about that because there was a question that came up talking about the leading cause of litigation. But I think the last bullet is important as well, is that you want to prevent a hostile work environment And this case was a Fresno, California case where a woman fire recruit was harassed by the drill instructors, was asked out on dates. She was a single mom, said that she should leave her, get rid of her kid, give it to her ex-husband because she's not focusing, wasn't given the same opportunity to participate in repeating the drills or skill assessments like the male firefighters were. She filed a lawsuit, and with good cause, and won over $2 million in a city that was self-insured. That's the first thing, so they pay out of their own pocket, and they're on the verge of bankruptcy, not because of this, but because of when this lawsuit occurred, the economy in California was pretty hard on municipalities, and so there's several municipalities that went bankrupt as a result of, maybe poor investments or not enough revenue, those sorts of things. So over a $2 million settlement, and then the lawyer got $900,000 as a result of that. So it's almost a $3 million claim because, people were conducting themselves inappropriately and in a boot camp sort of concept. So we alluded earlier to a lot of the NFPA guidelines, and that's exactly what they are until you adopt them. So the 1001 is the standard. That's we all basically firefighter 1 and 2. We take a look at that. One of the things that you want to make sure is your drivers are adequately trained in the driving apparatus. The number of vehicle accidents involving apparatus kills a number of firefighters and civilians, and has a high litigation rate, ending up in large judgments against departments because we just are not following the rules. 1041, fire service instructors, professional, just take a look at it. It may be onerous in your organization to adopt it, but if you're going to be the training officer in your organization, you at least want to know what the standards are that we're going to be applying as lawyers if you get sued in our defense. And even the opposing counsel, the plaintiff's counsel, will take a look at the NFPA standards too. We already alluded to the 1403, acquired structures, and make sure that your firefighters are certified as instructors under 1403, and there's a lot of training out there that's available. Respiratory protection training, and then the NFPA 1500 is a safety standard, which we all should apply, but at least be aware of what the safety standard is. Like I said, our state has adopted the NFPA 1500 standard, and so all departments have to comply with that particular standard. And again, additional, a safety officer, the 1582 is the medical standard. So for candidate firefighters and incumbent firefighters, there's two separate sections in there. Take a look at those to make sure that your firefighters are medically qualified. 1583 is the ongoing health programs in your organization. Peer fitness for those of you who have it, but there's a lot of good material in there for ongoing fitness programs for your organization. Technical rescue and technical rescue professional qualifications. Again, these are standards you want to take a look at. So if you're going to run a technical rescue class, make sure you get qualified instructors to do it, and just instead of going out and digging a hole in your back of your fire station and then doing a trench rescue drill, which is going to end up badly, I can tell you that right now. So make sure that you have qualified instructors for these rescue classes as well. And so under OSHA, which is another organization that kind of regulates government, and most of you are in government if you're working for a fire district or a municipality, all department members shall be provided with training at least annually. And so, that's a lofty goal, but, their hours are like 6 hours. And that's not nearly enough. And so, although OSHA says, thou shalt, provide training, what they talk about is not nearly enough training. And many of you guys who are currently training officers, who want to be training officers, understand that the OSHA minimum standard is not enough for an organization to be successful and safe. And so we take a look at the other parts of OSHA. Incident commanders should be trained. SCBA, we're required by OSHA to provide SCBA training, which is obviously more than 6 hours a year. Respiratory protection programs, so you have to do fit testing for your firefighters that wear SCBAs. They should do, or you should do, or you have to do fit testing for your N95 mask that you use on medical aid calls or rehab. Bloodborne pathogen programs is a requirement. the OSHA 147 standard, the lockout tagout for vaults or electrical vaults especially. And then for those of you who participate in hazardous materials response, there's certain requirements that you have for entry, for awareness and entry and then command, 3 complicated levels of training. So make sure that you have all of these OSHA standards in your playbook. So when you're actually training or putting out a training schedule for a year, that you're incorporating at least some of these in either annually or biannually. Our organization would do rotate our training every 3 years. Some of it we could do only because of time factors. Others we had to do annual training, annual recertification training, in certain aspects of what OSHA requires us to do. So be aware of what those particular training requirements are. So we want to make sure that we're trained frequently enough to ensure safety, not only of our firefighters, but for our community as well. And so we don't want to endanger yourself as a firefighter participant, the training officer, fellow firefighters, or your community. And so, how much training is enough? And that's something that you need as training officers to take a look at and ensure that you're doing enough and adequate training in your organization. So we take a look at first responder training. Again, 8 hours for first responder. Anti-harassment training is a best practice. Workplace violence, we're seeing an uptick in workplace violence. Sometimes our firefighters go crazy on us and create a harassing or hostile environment, and have assaults in the fire station. And so we need to avoid that sort of stuff. We need to train our firefighters how to mitigate or chill somebody who's aggressive in the fire station, especially if it's another firefighter. So those are, I think, required trainings as well. We take a look at the NFPA Firefighter 1 and 2. We already talked about that. Some states have dictated how much training that they believe is a necessary amount. So for an example, in the state of Ohio, they take a look at 36 hours of training per year. For me, that's not nearly enough. But in some departments, they may be the only time that they actually have to train. In Grants Pass, Oregon, they said 260 hours is enough training for their firefighters. And so you take a look at training as being a continual process, The ISO ratings, for those of you who have ISO certifications, they take a look at the different aspects of what they would evaluate when they're coming into your organization for ISO certification. So it talks about company training, classes for officers. Certainly new driver operator training is a 60-hour requirement. That's a lot of training, but we drive giant machines around our community at high speed, so we want to make sure that our driver operators are as highly trained as possible. Excuse me. Existing driver operator training is a refresher course every year. We talk about hazardous materials. And then for your recruits, 240 hours is probably the minimum for first-year training. So that's a lot of hours. That's a lot of dedication in an organization that may be small. And even an organization that is large, like a metro department or a large city department, that's a lot of training time. You have to kind of weasel in through the regular workday. So as a training officer, we want to make sure that you have more training, higher skill level than your firefighters that you're training. And then also if you have the potential or possibility to be certified as a trainer, and again, there's enough organizations out there that can help you get certified as a trainer, I would take advantage of those as well. And some of the requirements that you would take a look at while you're trying to achieve your training, again, is the 1041 we talked about, the 1001 in Firefighter 1 and 2, any sort of NFPA specialty training. And then there's a lot of books like IFSTA has a manual, ISFSI has a manual, NFPA has a lot of manuals and guidelines that you can utilize in order to kind of round out your journey to be a certified trainer. Again, we do have responsibilities. Not only you do as firefighters, like I said earlier, you're the safety officer at the training ground, but you want to be the expert. So when I come into your department, I want to look at somebody in your department. You got to be the expert if you're the training officer. So you got to know the rules, the regulations, your policy, your best practices, your state laws, because opposing counsel is going to grind you down on the witness stand or in a deposition if you don't know what you're talking about. So you got to know what you're talking about, be the expert, and get out there. Maintain personal training. Go to the training events. Again, FDIC, International Fire Chiefs, the Firefighters Association, the Volunteers Associations all have training events for firefighters. So get out there as much as you can. We want you to read our journals. There's a lot of training material either in print or online. You want to stay current, and then you want to be networking with other training officers, because that's how most of us learn. I'm a guy that I like to read. I did go to law school, which is painful for the amount of reading, but I'm a tactile guy. I like to touch stuff and I like to see stuff, and that's probably the way the majority of us are. But we want to talk to other training instructors around your neighborhood or in the country by going to these conferences and see what they've done, what's been successful for them. And then you set up a network. So I can make a phone call to my neighboring training officer or somebody in Chicago or New York or anywhere in the country and say, hey, we're going to put this new training program together. Can you send us the material that you guys use? And people are willing to share. I think our industry is very good about sharing material as well. So, and then we want to ask questions of our peers. And that's why we're here. If there's a question after this presentation is over, I have a website and a phone and an email address. You can certainly call me to get additional information. I encourage that sort of stuff. I don't charge you, so it's all free. But again, I think it's important to reach out to people, and if I don't know the answer, I'll direct you to somewhere else. On the right-hand side of your screen, we want to talk about technology, and we are moving, even in the fire service, to a more technologically based fire training learning environment. So much of the stuff that we do, the reading stuff, the didactic classroom stuff, should be done online. We can watch videos and films of skills and application of those particular skills. Where the rubber really hits the road is when you take your firefighters out on the drill ground or into your community to ensure that they are well trained when you do their assessment of skills. And then take a look at, at the end of the training event, was it good? Was it bad? Was it horrible? Could we do it better? Did we do it the best we possibly could based on resources? So spend 10 or 15 minutes after a training event. Talk to your firefighters to figure out, is this a good drill? And then if it's a good drill, capture it, and then you can, reload it later in a couple of years or for a new academy that may be coming down the pike. And then again, we want to make sure that we provide a fundamental knowledge base so our firefighters can respond to all hazards, because like I said earlier today, you cannot put together a program that's going to cover every single solitary event that we're going to, and then try not to kill our firefighters, and not to be facetious, but it's probably the worst event you could ever endure, your department could ever go through, and you'll never forgive yourself if a firefighter dies while in your charge. So you want to stay current on, and this will add again to your knowledge base, the training standards for NFPA and OSHA, the technology. I would go out. One of the things I like to do is take my firefighters out on training exercises in new construction, taking a look at the lightweight material. How long are you going to be in this building? Is it going to be 10 minutes? Or an old, heavy timbered building, you got 20 minutes at most. But lightweight construction, we need to know where that all is. We need to take a look at your hazards in your community. And we already talked about budget and staffing. And I'm talking to you about the legal issues. So if you have any legal issues, questions, please give me a call. And so my good friend Mark Twain said, it's better to be safe 100 times than dead one time. And that's where safety comes in to your training events. We have a lot of people watching us, your firefighters most notably, Department of Labor, the worker safety agencies, the public, the press. I always tell people the thing that sells newspaper is bad news. And so if you have a bad news event in your organization, you're going to be, front and center page. So make sure you understand who's watching what you're doing at all times, and including OSHA, the EPA, Center for Disease Control, NIOSH will come in and do basically an investigation for a firefighter death, and hopefully none of you have been a participant in that, but if you take a look at the NIOSH reports on firefighter deaths, there's a lot of valuable information on how to avoid those particular events in your organization. And then always the NFPA consensus standards or guidelines. If you adopt the standard, you have to participate in the standard at 100%, or you're violating your own rules. Excuse me. So let's switch over to documentation here real quick. And I said earlier, if it wasn't documentation, or I'm sorry, if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen because you don't have any record of what went on. Your recall memory in 3 years after the statute of limitations is up, when you do get sued, is very, very bad. And so any sort of training form that you use would equals documentation. And it could be a checklist, it could be a roster, it could be what the training event is and who participated, who the training officer was. I always tell people, you don't have to write War and Peace. We're not looking for a novel when you're doing documentation, but we're looking for enough material that it becomes your recall memory. If you get sued and if you have to go to court, you can use this documentation as an affirmative defense. So documentation is a record of an event, your proof of compliance with the state and local laws, looks at efficiency and proficiency. So, do you train once every 3 months? That's probably not as efficient or proficient. So you want to make sure that you train frequently and you document that training. And again, it's your recall memory and your evidence in court, and it is your affirmative best defense if you get sued by a former firefighter or a family of a deceased firefighter. We want to make sure that you are writing professionally. I can't tell you how many times I do records review on fire departments, and some of the stuff that comes out of supposedly intelligent firefighters is like, oh my gosh, how would they write that sort of stuff, or how could they write that stuff? So you take a look at, objective, factual patterns, sentence structure, spelling. Don't create unrecognized abbreviations that only you recognize, but will forget probably in 24 hours. So make sure that you use the standard abbreviations in the fire service or the EMS side. And then if you're writing on paper, make sure it's legible. But most of us have transferred over to some sort of an electronic document. So hopefully you've done that. Those are records that are kept for a long period of time. But even Word, spell check in Word can misspell a word. So you want to make sure that the word is spelled correctly. You want to create the document as soon as the training event's over so it's fresh in your memory. And then don't document after the fact. And what I classify as after the fact is when somebody knocks on the front door of your fire station and says you've been served with a summons and complaint, you're being sued by one of your former firefighters, that you look at the records and there's nothing there. Never let a firefighter, your fire officer, or yourself create a record 3 years later, because it's going to get just tossed out of court for being a creation of fiction and not a reality issue. It's dealing with what actually happened during the event. And then you want to take a look at these factors by asking yourself at the end, is it complete? Is it compliant? Do we use the correct terminology, especially in pumping or hose lays or those sorts of things? There's a lot of technical jargon out there that the layperson doesn't understand. And if you go to a jury trial, the layperson is on the jury. It's not a bunch of firefighters that are going to be judging you for what occurred. So it's a bunch of people from your community that don't have a clue about what goes on in the fire department. So you want to make sure that you use the correct terminology, because you're going to be educating the jury if you get up on the witness stand. You want to only document the important stuff. The frivolous stuff, forget about it. Nobody remembers it. It wasn't important to the outcome of the drill. And so make sure you only document the important stuff. And then, is it enough? And so I always tell people to read their documentation when they're done. And does that put a clear picture in your mind of what happens? And the other thing is, when I arrive in your doorstep to defend your organization, can I be at the scene that you were at the scene 3 years or 4 years ago, so I can get a clear picture of how to defend actions that went on in your organization? So is it enough? We all want to get rid of records over time. For some of us, we have attics in our fire station. They're full of paper files. Every state has a records retention program. and your department should adhere to the records retention program on destruction of records. Make sure you shred the records. Don't just throw them in the dumpster because there's a lot of private information in there that you don't want the public to see. And then if you have electronic records like disks or thumb drive, or you get permission to destroy a hard drive, you want to make sure that it's completely destroyed. And there's a lot of services out there that will do electronic demagnetization. That's a big word. I barely made it. A big word about demagnetizing your hard drive or your disks so they become unrecognizable. You want to make sure that you don't destroy records early. That's a crime. It's called spoliation. It's a crime in every state. It has criminal nexus to it. So if you destroy records, pictures, sound recordings, and those sorts of things on an important event in your organization, and you get charged, in a lawsuit, or there's a criminal thing going on where you may have been grossly negligent, and our local prosecutor says, well, you're grossly negligent. Under the criminal statutes, we're going to charge you. So you can't be out there shredding records because you're going to go to jail for spoliation or destruction of records. So make sure that you follow your state records retention guides as well. All of these people are looking at your reading. So the media, the public, your staff, certainly other departments, first responders, investigators, the police, and attorneys. And remember that people just cannot come into your organization to pull a record out of a file or go searching through your hard drive and looking for certain records. They have to have a request or a warrant. So don't let anybody just come in, say, hey, I want to look at your laptop, I want to look at your hard drive, I want to look through your files, because they have to have some sort of a legal basis for doing that sort of stuff. And back in the old days, we used to just give it all up. But now, because of patient protection and employee protection for information, we have to have a records request. And many states have those forms available, and your department should have a form available to the public so they can request a record. And so again, these are the people that are reading, the mediators and arbitrators, other parties, insurance, judges, your elected officials, if you have commissioners or elected board, they're looking at your stuff pretty much all the time. So make sure you're writing appropriately. And then what you write can and will be used against you in a court of law. So make sure that you understand what you've written, that it doesn't throw you under the bus or incriminate bad behavior. You don't want to lie. You want to be truthful in there. But again, your records are going to be used for you in an affirmative defense, or they're going to be used against you by the plaintiff's attorney. So just remember what you write. Now, some people say, well, if I don't write it, then they can't use it against me, and that's not true. Because even if you don't write it, there's enough circumstantial or other evidence out there that people can come in and say, oh, yeah, this is what occurred. Oh, yeah, this is what I recorded. Oh, yeah, this is what I saw. So you can use that sort of, material to build a case against an organization for, gross negligent conduct, or especially when it injures or kills a firefighter. So preventative measures, the best legal practice for risk mitigation. And again, qualified training officer, read and understand, ensure your pre-training classroom exposure is up to date. So you want to make sure that, if you have books to read, magazines to read, journals to read, handouts, stuff that's online, make sure your firefighter has availability to all those things before you go out and actually put the skill out for your evaluation. We talked about correct and working PPE, including breathing apparatus, physical conditioning or medical physicals. We have a number of overweight firefighters perfectly capable of doing the job. As a matter of fact, we've had some of our firefighters in my department that were very overweight, but going through a medical physical, they didn't have any medical problems other than their weight. And so their doctors directed them to do some weight loss things. And some of our firefighters lost like whole people, 160-pound weight loss from different, bariatric surgeries or diets or exercise. So make sure your firefighters are well medically qualified to participate and play. And then play by the known rules, right? So the known rules are stuff that are in your statutes, your laws, your best practices, your policies, those sorts of things. Don't just go fly by the seat of your pants and think, oh, this is going to be a good drill, because it's going to be a disaster. And so don't even go down there, because there are going to be people who are going to get hurt and they're going to sue your organization. So be very careful. Number 7 is have a playbook with training objectives, and those should be published early and given out. Let your firefighters know what is going on the drill ground, and then you want to pre-plan for an emergency. So I have a story which I don't have enough time to tell, but if I come to your department and teach the class or at a conference that you see me at, I have a story about my partner, Rick Crimmins, who unfortunately has since deceased from cancer, on pre-planning known hazards. And this was the pre-inspect training grounds for hazards. So you want to make sure you have a safety officer. You want to practice like you're going to play. You want to document those sorts of things. Just be aware of your training time and your environment, extreme heat, extreme cold, dampness, wetness, those sorts of things. Make sure you're prepared for those sorts of environmental challenges as well. And then document your accidents and injuries. Again, somebody's going to come back, either the state, the prosecutor, your insurance company, the family of the firefighter, or the firefighter is going to come back. You want to have adequate documentation. And then, again, you want to do post-training assessment and debrief, and just sit on the tailboard or in a classroom or in the shade or something to just talk about the drill, which I think is extremely important. And then affirmative defenses, just a recap, know and understand your training requirements. So you're going to be the person that's going to get called up in the witness stand. You're the person that I'm going to interview and depose, or the opposing counsel is going to depose. We want to make sure that you know what's going on. You want to be the expert in your field. You want to maintain any sort of certifications that you acquire. And if there's a recertification requirement, that you're recertified, especially in the areas that you're teaching. Follow the rules, and then document. So documentation is your best evidence and your best affirmative defense. And then filing that away in a safe place is equally impressive. So there's a couple of questions here, but I just want to recap what we went through our goals. So we've got to understand your liabilities and how to manage that risk. Hopefully we talked about what good training is. Some of it we talk about laying a solid foundation for training that people can respond to different and challenging events in their community that you may never have an opportunity to trade on. Take a look at the federal and state laws that affect training. They're out there. So OSHA, for one, your state laws for safety. You want to take a look at, this one case in California is a discrimination case. So, people that have disabilities are protected, people that are old, over the age of 40, males and females. I mean, there's a whole bunch of protections out there that you as a training officer don't want to violate their rights. You want to talk about how to avoid liability and identify what those liable events could be, and then talk about documentation and then preventative measures. So that's kind of the end. This is who I am, John Murphy. If you have a question and we don't answer, or maybe you've created 100 questions, feel free to email me. I respond to everything. If you call me, it probably will go to voicemail, and I appreciate the voicemail, and I do call back. And so before we get off this thing, if I got a couple of minutes, one of your participants said, oh, thanks, Chris. So one of the participants said, what would you say is the leading cause of litigation in the fire industry related to training? And I think it was more the last sentence. So actually two. One is we're ill-equipped to meet the hazards, the known hazards or the unknown hazards, because we have not provided a broad base of basic training so people can kind of think through and problem solve critical issues out in the field. And the second highest litigated issue in the fire service are firefighters. We have a tendency to sue ourselves because of workplace harassment, bullying, creating a dangerous situation, discrimination, those sorts of things. So if you take a look at, the frequency of litigation that goes on in the fire service is because we sue ourselves, because our management chooses to ignore it. We don't have adequate policies in place. If we do, we don't even follow our own policies. So we want to make sure that you do have policies. And so the other question is it more likely that a court will find negligence in training operations when you don't meet NFPA standards? And I think, and that's a great question. And so if you adopt the NFPA standard, for an example, if you adopt the NFPA 1500 standard, or you should adopt the 1403 standard. If you don't follow those tenets to the letter, then there's a liability there. If you, like for an example, staffing, the 1041 standard, I think that is, they want minimum staffing. Most departments cannot do minimum staffing, but if you do the best you can, that's a good defense. So the best you can, even though it seems weak, is we're doing the best we can with the resources that we have, the finances that we have, the community norms and community standards. When there's a litigation or a lawsuit, I'm one of the expert witnesses that will come and testify, on your behalf that you did the best you could with the resources that you had. If you adopt a standard, 1500 or 1403, if you don't follow to the letter of those standards, I can't come in and defend you on those particular standards because you adopted them, you didn't follow them. That's an issue that's going to kind of bite you in the backside. Just as a make people aware, not a lot of this stuff goes to court. Many times, if you're covered by an insurance company, the insurance company will make a decision to settle most of the time because it's very expensive to litigate or defend on a claim. And so a lot of times the insurance companies will go to mediation or arbitration, which I'm doing in a couple of weeks, to try to get to a settlement to avoid going to court. So you may never get to court, but your records are certainly going to be used in that whole process of, how did we get here? What's the value of this particular event? Is it $1 million? Is it $5 million? What is it? So they'll value the case, and they'll make an offer of settlement to the opposing party, and you may never even get to a court. Let's see. So the last question, I think, is, in my experience, how much of the legal aspects responsibility of a company officers offer as a priority during any fire officer prep course or professional development? And I think that that's, I don't want to say the guy's name, but that's an awesome question. I go around, there's 5 or 6 of us out here that teach classes all over the United States. Kurt Verone is one, Chip Comstock, myself, Brad Pinsky. There's Alyssa Arnorf from Chicago. There's a ton of us out there that go out and teach, legal, try to mitigate your legal hazards in your organization. And if you look at the journals, and I don't want to give Kurt Verone any extra time, but if you take a look at his website, every day there's something in there that we screw up somehow. And so even though we were preaching to the choir and everybody goes, oh, yeah, we understand that, it's like we see this stuff every day. So I don't know if we don't do a good enough job in teaching people what their legal responsibilities or liabilities are. But I think it should be a part of the curriculum when you're learning to be an officer. And certainly there's, I do some class work for one of the universities. And so we have a fire and emergency services program. We talk about legal issues affecting the fire service. And these are individuals who are getting their degree in fire management. And so we try to get to them what the importance of providing a legally safe environment for your firefighters are, certainly along with a fire safety training environment. And if you have a safe environment for training, you're not going to even see a lawyer on the horizon coming your way. So I think it's just incumbent on us. We're smart enough to figure this out, and so we need to just be aware of what's going on. I think that's, let's see, one more. At what point does the liability of training officers get relinquished when the safety hazards are brought forward to training chiefs and authorities having jurisdiction? And that's a great question as well. And I'll always say, if you document that you've passed on a training hazard or a potential hazard to the training chief or the chief of the department or your municipality, and they just kind of blow you off, I wouldn't do the training drill because you know that there's a hazard. So there's probably a little bit of blowback on you. But if they say to proceed with the training, then you have a judgment to make. Do you proceed with a hazardous training, or do you say no, and we're going to change it to something that's a lot safer? So I think a lot of that sort of decision process comes down to your judgment because, when you deal with the authorities having jurisdiction, which may be a manager, a city manager who doesn't know a lot about the fire department unless he's a firefighter, the mayor, who's an elected person, the council or the commissioners are mostly elected civilians, don't understand, what the potential hazard is. So you may have to go to them and say, look, you're approving a dangerous environment. You're approving, some training that goes way beyond the pale. We're not prepared to do this. We don't have the equipment or the training. The responsibility will lay with them, but you're going to be involved in that decision-making process. So let's not go there, and that was a great question. And so at the end, and I'm sure that Chris has a few things to say, but from my perspective, thank you very much for spending an hour and 10 minutes or more with me talking about training liabilities and documentation. This is the tip of the iceberg, and so there's a lot more to talk about. More than happy to come to your department. I teach in a lot of conferences around the country. Hopefully I'll see you there. But until that time, thank you very much and be safe, and appreciate what you do for your community.
John, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and sharing your expertise.
You're welcome.
I'd like to thank all of you for attending as well. As we close out here in just a moment, you're going to receive a brief survey regarding today's content. We'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to fill it out. We'd love to get your feedback, and we'd also like to find out what other topics you'd like us to cover in the future. So that's it for today. Please join us again in the future for additional sessions of the Public Safety Innovation webinar series. Have a great afternoon.